Page number 20. A new profile of writing. I am grateful to Sri Venkateshwara College, the English department, and the especially Pradeep Anwar and the Sambandhu for inviting me to give these lecture on the novel. Almost every literate person today, if he or she reads anything apart from newspaper, reads novels, watch many lectures, persons also either write novels or humble secret thoughts of writing them. The general idea seems to be that if you have lived a life, you can write at least one story, preferable you on one man woman one wrote one life one novel. Fiction is the most democratic, not to say nectar of lecture genres, almost enriched in so much as no kind of discipline seems to be called for, no apprenticeship or training, no rules of the game. It is a hardly a literary genre, genre any longer, but as an American might put it, as a jungle out there, which literary jungle has hosted on top of itself a parasitically critical jungle of its own. This is being so it would be not pupil prestigious but fertile to attempt anything like mapping the domain of the novel. The purpose in this lecture is rather to go back in time to the earliest novelist and to focus on a headful of old and the old function novel in order to see whether and how it all began. Starting out in reach any with these novelists own democratic or definition of their domain, the territory they were stacking out of themselves, and the sick signpost they were hanging out of their own and future times. I shall be with their definitions and the understanding, but our understanding will include but also naturally go beyond those definitions, and in this present case the broader understanding will be based on a reading the novel together centrally as it were, and b more important focusing on the domain of the novel in that thought the surrounding interactive domain of history, society and politics. I would like to make two further pre- prefatory points. One, when I saw old and old function, I mean the 18th and the early 19th century, when the novel first emerged in Europe, to my way of thinking as a part of the journal process of the overhauling the order formation of life as well as the old forms. Page number 21 of literary second. If there is any single this running thoughts this lecture, it is my simple one, namely that the domain of novel is and was from the outset, and the internal conflict, a dialogical and the dialectical domain, three function words all out once, fascinating me not because of the poetries themselves but the way in which various novelistic try to manage or resolve these poetries. My lecture today will focus largely on some well-known English novels. The second lecture under the rubric of nationality and the novel will focus mainly on novels produced in a few countries which had what I term a sense of the belated nationalist, such as earlier 19th century Russia and the late 19th century India. The focus of the third lecture will be on a few 19th century American novel under the general rubric of the ideologically and the novel, which is in itself a concept that is a preliminary way bridge and the Politics were the individual and the political, the physiological and the social are identically one and the same. The subject today being the English novel, the beginning point inevitably in Henry Fielding, who, when he turned from stage comedies and the verses to prose fiction, through of themselves as the founder of a new provine of writing. Tom Jones BK. 2 chapter 153 and the accordingly considered is it incumbent upon itself to define this lecture literary territory which he did in this perfected writing the prestigious and the almost exclusively through the use of the oxy- oxymoronous right and the outset some of the poetries I spoke of a moment ago get get expressed at is contradictory meaning which finding a definition of the novel the most famously in the definition or comic epic poem is verse in the preface of the Joseph Andrew worried later in the Tom Jones to such phrases or the Processia Comi epic writing and a heroic historical processes poem in Tom Jones. He also defined his work as a narrative of plain matter of the fact. The Tom Jones he also defined his work as the narrative of the plain matter of fact, a newspaper of many volumes, but at the same time ranked himself not with the journalist of the day, but with historian of the same order as the Homer and the Milton. At other place, he defined the novel as a domestic history or the simply as a history. That is to say, the life of the biography of the one individual. At one level, these linguistic contradictions can be seen as a neoclassical writers of the ancient classical the reference of Homer and the other writers the antiquity including the lost and Aristotelian pressing on comedy suggests the awareness of the Austrian writer that was whatever many seems new will in fact turn out of the merely a new version of old, but the matter is not too simple, and indeed there is a point here for the domain of fielding novel can be seen as much as a colonization of a new territory and the rehabilitation of an old literary terrain in various ways. The epic may be rejected, but it gets wrinkle or in Shelley dialectical imagery may be eclipsed, but in enthusiastic way. Page number 22. This is, I think, personally the crux of Fielding's oxymoronic definition of the novel as a comic epic, and this in various ways, as I shall argue suggests the doubleness between the comic and the epic, the individual and the socio-historical private life, and the alcohol will the underlines a great many novels after building up to our own day. But at present, I would rather look only at one side of the argument and consider what is new and the ended recovery relation in fielding theory and the practice as a novelistic, mainly this rejection of the epic, not only this rejection of the epic protagonist of the sublime define the mythological or the superhuman power and the character, but more so this echoes as a fable involving not just in this personal future but the whole history of the destiny of the some longer collective entity, a tribe, a race, a community, a police, a whole society or nation. The fall of Troy as the allied and the founder of Rome as a Virgil ended the story of the whole country as in the Mar- Mahabharata, the eternal destiny of all mankind as in Milton, the Adam's fall we seen all. On the other hand, the installation of the comic in the sense of the commonplace, the ordinary, the topical, the matter of fact, protagonist of low, even at times marginal rank, engaged in living ordinary lives in common palace, pursuit of the commonest of the common palace goals, marriage, and the mean mean of the livelihood in middle class perclave love and future, their fable involving no longer destiny than their our own domestic personal private life biographies of individual rather than of history making epic heroes, all kind of character rhetorical including from lecture make their appearance center stage, like Rich Harden's maid servant Famila Decoys Pekara Mole Fledders Finding Ounce Footmans in Joseph Andrew, as well as the Buster Tom Jones. We remember how Edmund in King Lear and cried out, now goods stand up for the bastard, not too prematurely. I think I since by the time of the Tom John the good literature themselves were already standing up for the bastards and the regarding bastards and the other such commonplace, rewarding them with upward mobility through the fable of love and marriage. Richard's maid servant Famila ending as a wife of a country acquire, and the Tom John winning not only the beautiful Sophia but also her estate as well as the Square Elwood's estates called Paradise Hall. The custody is, of course, to be understood socially rather than the biologically, signifying the breaking of the new man into the precious of the older hierarchy classes, glancing ahead as we move into the 19th century, while these so-called common people in the so-called age of the common man become more respectable, more acceptable to society and the literature, their mainstream fable remains, especially the story of love, marriage, and the private concern. Indeed, 120 years after Tom Jones, George Eliot and the Middle March rises again, the precisely in the issue of the reducing of the novels domain from the epic of the domestic to Mer's story of love and marriage. Page number 23. With a pointed reference in chapter 15 to Fielding, a great historian, as he insisted on calling themselves, and more specifically of finding a copious remark, digression, and especially the prefatory chapter in Tom Jones in short, exactly the place where Fielding and elaborated his definition of the novel as a comic epic. George Eliot herself uses the word epic constantly. Epic needs epic life, epic destiny. Although in her case, an equally appropriate word would be epochal or epoch making. Make that is the destiny explain it, marking the beginning of an era in history, in science and life, and it is this common element of the frustration of the epochal that made her combine two stories in Middlemarch as we have it today. The stories of her two protagonists, Dr. Lightgate and Dahlia Brock, which, as we know, were originally conceived and partly written as separate works, so that one can read Middlemarch as a novel, but novel writing to the extent that as a combined narrative engages as a narrative. The question of what novel have traditionally narrated as against that they may or should narrate, as she put it in the chapter 15, which was the first chapter of the original Middlemarch and the where she had first invoked Fielding with regard to one of her hero, Dr. Lygate's stories. Were not afraid of telling over and over again how a man comes to fall in love with a woman and be wedded to her or else be fatally parroted parroted from her is a due to excess of poetry or so stupidity that we are never very of describing what kind James called a woman's magnum, and her ferociousness never wears of listening, and the twanging of the old bordered string and are comparatively uninterested in that other kind of magnum and the fairness which must be wood in the industries through and the patient renunciation of small degrees. The passion for a larger and epic destiny would world altering passion, which in Ligate's case is the passion of scientist discovery leading to a revolution in the middle science. The epic, the epic paradigm for her second protagonist, Dorothea Brock, is out leading in the prelude through the example of the Esther Thracia, the 16th century Spanish girl who joined the church, whose heart as Georgia Eliot puts it beat from the outset of the national idea, demanding an epic life, and who thought evolved at first by domestic relating in the shape of uncle is eventually founded her equals in the reform as a religious order. Now here are these two anti-fielding paradigm. Why comic epic? Why not epic per se? Why not protagonist whose fable involves not only page number 24 their destiny but all our destinies in Dorothea's case as much as in the Ligate. However, the paradigm function in and only as a sad or the tragic underlining of their actually life struggle for their later day. Thracia, although actually imbued with passionate epic inspiration, accomplished no epic destiny, no fair regular acting or longer recognizable did. They become the founder and foundress of the nothing, and their story too get reduced of the personal and the domestic. Invariably, a modern reader asks why George Eliot did not write lengthy paraphrases in the manner of Fielding. As she says, he lived in an ample age when the days were longer, when summer afternoons were spacious and the clock ticked slowly in the winter evening. If belated historians like herself lingered after his example, their chat would probably sound thin and eager, and in any case she had work enough to show the wearing in the interwearing of man human lots that constitute the web of the life that he calls a middle march. Indeed, it is the specific working out of the character, circumstances, and the destiny in the middle march. It is a novel itself rather than the authorical commentary which constitution and the critical intervention on the issue of the comic domestic versus the epic at and the appropriate movement in the double development of the English novel, exactly middle way between Fielding time and our own age. Middlemarch may thus be said to be embodied in itself as a novel, both a challenge to and an acceptable of unlimited domain for the novel. Descriptively, the answer of the question why is given in the last two pages that through potentially epoch making the personalities continue to be born. The medium in which their adult needs took shape a forever gone. Epoch making is no longer possible. The modern world, it would seem defeats all aspirations to do fundamental world alternating historical deeds being impossible. The only hope for the future lies in what George Eliot called the diffusive impulsive of the example and the individual gods deeds of small unhistorical changes for the growing good of the world in the partly dependent on unhistoric fact that the thing are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half earning of the number of world lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in the unvisited tombs. One would be sorely tempered at the time to start trace the rise and the future of liberally humanism in British political through and practice in the 19th and the 20th centuries on trace the diminution or indeed the privatization of the novel's domain from E. M. Foster's well known valorization of personal relation, the famous if I had to choose between the betraying my friend, page number 25, or my country, I hope good gives me guts to betray my country. Two cheers for democracy, comma 66. An absolute opposite between the individual and the police of his less known declaration earlier in the essay. I believe in personal relationship, for here is something solid in the world full of violence and critically or we would like of D. H. Lawrence of explorations of the sexual experiencing on the sexual ethic and go no of the interior exploration of the so-called stream of expo consciousness level. But it is time to retrace my steps and more important call a halt to this one-sided argumentation and go back to the polities of the novels domains, the polities of the individual collection, private, public, comma physiological, social, biographical, cultural, domestic, national, topical, historical, universal, etc. And see how is a diminution also becomes at the same time infacement of various kinds with regard of the novelistic just mentioned. Joyce Hugley comic novel Consciousness Ulysses is not only titled after but alludes constantly to and the revincement, so to speak, one of the three founding species of the Western civilization. As the novelistic, the artist, as the young man say, the very last page of that the preceding novel, a portrait of the artist as a young man. Welcome, alive. oblique. I go to the encounter of the militant time of the reality of the experience, and to fork in the smith of my soul, the uncreated conscious of race, just opposing reality and race on the one hand with soul and the conceive on the other. D.H. Lawrence, a novel noxious of for the sex in them, perhaps still more interesting in my view as a novel of cultural and the class differential. As for E.M. Forster's is novel are first and the last novel of culture, conflict, and the mutually critique southern Italy and the northern England in were angel were to trade India and British the oriented and the western in a passage of India. Switzerland in war angels were to trade as a metonic representation of the agreed benevolent narrow-minded British middle class, or the theme of the Philistines him versus culture, and the Wilcoxes versus the Sigils in Howard, England, and the House Horwards ends itself standing for the Foster's view of the British heritage and the fusion of the connection, rather than conflict of classes and the culture. And finally, Middlemarch, wonderful as it is collection of the at least six individual stories, as is still more wonderful for that she calls a study of the provisional life, and which is George Eliot scholar Gordon Haight tell us described to him for a various historians as the finest picture he knew of England at the time of the Reform Bill. I'm now going I'm now going back to Fielding and the other novel writing between his time, and George Eliot had the fascinating means and the mechanism, the formal devices used by the various novelists to manage the polities phrased in the seemingly endless sphere of what I mentioned earlier, the resolve them, the teleological of various kind, allergies, symbols, and the metamines. Page number 26. House novel like Jane Austen's Mansfield Park and the Northanger Abbey, Emily Brodney, Wuthering Heights, Orthons, and the House of the Seven Goblins, Family Sagas, the Life Thomas Mann's Burden books dealing with the German merchant middle classes, or John Galsworth, the war style saga, which become class exploration and ended as a reader of novels. We will ask ourselves whether or not we are conscious of it. In the love of the stories, the personal stories, the involvement with the hero or heroine, or the empathy with the hero and the heroines in his works were considered powerful or the significant, as we are not looking something beyond the individuals and the particular situation of the representation of the some longer collective entity as a whole approach or the social order of the means used by the novelist to this end, and the best known perhaps in the theory of type originated by the Russian democratic and the revolution critic B. Links in the middle 19th century, developed by the successor of Borolov, most memorable in his long essay What is Oblong Motifs, and made famous in 20th century by George Lacaze and the Hungarian Marxist literary historian and the critic in studies in European realism, originally developed by developed from applied to the classic Russian novel in the 19th century. This history will be more directly useful in this second lecture, where a large part of the discussion will focus on the Russia fiction. Here, let me just say the Bilinski's theory was not the only way for his novelist to resolve poetry's ended by my subject being the English novel today. I would at his point like to invert to Henry Fielding and look at his aspect as a novel and his other views. I am I have already I have already quoted Fielding's definition of the novel as a newspaper of many volumes. I would now like to add to it the following forms. The American novelist Hawthorne are perhaps too massive from an old massive work of the journalist is but the newspaper of the century and the perhaps of the hundred centuries. A hundred centuries, 10,000 years, pretty much define not just the domain of the literature but the time frame of human civilization itself. But the Hawthorne observation has the merit of the suggestion all the possibilities of the representation available to the novelist and all the possible interpretative preference available to the reader. To gloss the Hawthorne equations, the newspaper as in finding would signifying the daily life of ordinary person, which the novelist would represent with varying degree of subtly on the individual moral physiological plane. The newspaper of the century would involve the socio-historical plane, epic or approach making action or deeds as the Georgia Alloy definition, 100 century significance of a course of the subject, universal, the eternal verities of so fondly and the firmly derived by present day scholar in the humanities. Nevertheless it will be pointed out that the novelists themselves, like the Hawthorne, stress precisely his universal external plane as the essential plane of their representation. And so my mind instead of the dismissive summarily on the other of these planes, the more intercepting critical exercise for the student of the literature, as I suggested by referring to the theory of types a little earlier. It is to see the specific process whereby the representation on one plane get translated into another. More instance to revert of Fielding, the he declares in the very first prefatory chapter of Tom Jones that is subject in human nature, all capitalized, but we have to see in how this human nature in generally get transported into the combination of the moral and the socio-historical, and how through they themselves emphasize the individual aspect throughout. Tom Jones come across equally as an epic, not epic in the sense of the panoramic ecom- encompassing time and the space on a large scale, so varying the sense from the country on the to road to the London family and the funding and the accommodation for all sorts and the condition of him of man to crowd the sense and the incident of the story, the but epic more in the sense of a socio-historical portrait of mind 19th century society, of which I would like to emphasize two related aspects. First, The socio-historic is not presented as a bonus, something added over and above the normal individual, but precisely through his generous at searching moral analysis of individual, which operates as a diagnostic test of the larger social world in which his individual characters like as a function. Second, as a consciousness, the portrait, his picture of the approach become essential through not radically a critical picture. Third, in including his, I shall focus rather narrowly on the love and the marriage theme in Tom Jones and the other novel, and the how through the domestic we get the representation of the approach. In Tom Jones, his theme translated into two different things simultaneously but different. On the one hand, we have his love ethic as apart from his generally philanthropically ethic, and on the other his politically ethic, which itself translated into the equity the west versus the mercenary, and is seen in the almost everyone aspect. A few exponentially character as the heroine of the later novel Elizabeth Bennet in Jane Austen's Pride and the Prejudice, puts it what is the difference in the matrimonial affairs between the mercenary and the prudent motive. Where the discretion and avarice begin? His difference between description and the average is the precisely the subject of finding ironic motive analysis posed throughout Tom Jones in the contest. The Tom Sophia loved story through it in itself one of the finest story of love in English fiction, becomes also thus a test for page number 28. The world that surrounded them, it is a Middleton Murray described it once, a thread of gold running through the sordid texture of the society. Fielding as has been much precise of his irony, but it the pervasive use and the fiction that is thus performed in representing not just individual motivation but rather the collection portrait of the society of his time, has been properly understood. For irony is is his chief device for the fusion not being properly understood. For the irony in his chief device for the fusion of the one and the many, the individual and the society social, the common palace and the historically significant irony, and the simply logistic level in the expression of the one meaning by the language of opposite contradictory tendency. But his verbal irony at the least part of his nationally strategy. More important is his irony motive analysis, which with constantly exposed from beneath people profession his their real and the corded motivations. But the most important aspect of fielding irony involves a different kind of the doubleness altogether, a different kind of play between the opposition and the sameness. It is often said that the Fielding novel is a crowded. It is, but it is crowded not just by the variety, but the opposite and the opposition of the character, representing the two sides of some of the central political, social, electoral, elect, ele- um, electoral, and the religious debates of the 18th century. Wing and the Tory count and the country and counts the fairly and the independent country Square Western and his sister, and the sophisticated court lady Mrs. Western, and the and the advocate of the women's freedom, Dr. The Blifil, and the divine his brother Captain Blifil of the militia, and the two tutors, the Thowekon and the narrow-minded religious zealoton, and the square, the disguised philosopher, believers not in the spiritual revolution, but the rule of the right and the eternal fitness of things, and so on. Yet underneath his the superficially diversity and the mutual opposite, there is an essential sameness of or identity of motivation and the purpose. They all belong to what may be called the party of the predecessors, that is the aware and the self-seeking, together with most of the other character in Tom Jones, from the gamekeeper and the maid servant in the and the innkeepers to diverse London man and the women of wealth and fashion. Only one illustration will have to suffice, and that too bearing on the theme of money and the marriage only as relating to the case of Tom and the Sophia. Think of the main fable. Should Sophia marry Tom and Biffle Square? Western her technically rather looks her up. Mrs. Western, his freedom loving sister, and declared that the English women are not like Spanish slaves, and they should be given their liberty, but however opposition their personalities may be, their view, methods, purpose, and the motivation are the same. Both are equally determined to prevent Sophia marrying and the fruitless Tom, and the instead course here into marriage with the legal heir of the biggest estate in the neighborhood. Page number 29. For a square western puts it, certainly the two estates are joined together in the matrimonially already, and so therefore as we may put it, would the livestock on them. As to Mrs. Western, she began the processing my reading Sophia a long lecture on the subject of the matrimony, which she treated not as the romantic scheme of the happiness arriving from the love, as he had been described by the poet, or nor did she mention as the those purpose for which we are the taught by the divines of the regard, as it as instituted by the scared authority. She considered it rather as a found in the which prudent women devote reported their fortunes of the biggest adventure in the world, to receive a larger interest for them that would have elsewhere. 700 pages later, right at the end of the novel, we find her still lecturing her niece on the prudence and the matrimonial policy, still discouraging and the volley of love and the wisdom of the legal prestigiousness for hire. It is thus by revealing the sameness, the same sort of motivation in a large era of the diverse, mutually opposed human being, by the pervasive constant analysis that fielding irony waves thread by thread the scordia lecture of society itself, so that the morally analyzes itself, so accumulate, so overcome difference of personality, that is becomes itself a diagnostic test of society. I shall now turn to two novels of the 19th century, Dombey and the Sun and the Vanity Fair, in order to see where these significants hung and out so early by the fielding in Tom Jones lead us in the domain of the novel, keeping in mind all their possible trends and of the individual moral of the socio historical and the universal emphasis being on the meaning by which they were resolve or fail to resolve their possibilities of the point that some of these novels become openly recognizable and then indeed commonly recognized as a picture of the society, not so much moral critique and this fielding out rather than the representation through the individual stories of the very structure of 19th century British barbecue society. First of all, the intuition and I noted in Tom Jones of the large language of money and the commerce into the large of the love and marriage not only continues into the 19th century but become a pervasive conflation with enlarged application the meaning here all through. I shall talk to Jane Austen's Emma in my second lecture in an effort to inbuilt proceeding little. I would like to begin my quotation of following rather cavalier description of the Jane Austen by the Auden in his poem Letter or to Lord Byron, Part 1. Auden speaks of how uncomfortable he feels to see an English and spinster of the page number 30 middle class oblique describe the amorous effect of the brass and the revel of the economic basis of society. Brass and the amor, money, and love, leaving aside the exponential case that are 19th century novelistic continue to include the explum the mercenary motivation of marriage is now no longer seen as the brazen but as the commonplace acceptable norm, but something so much larger and important that just marriage is involved in Dombey and Son and Vanity Fair, which I would indicate by first quotation of the following from the Vanity Fair. Georgia as one describe of Vanity Fair as an ready money society, Beckney Sparsh and the declaration. I think I would be a good woman if I had 500,000 years, and I wish I would exchange my position in society and all my relation for I sung some in the 3% consoles and for significantly Osborne senior outburst. Honorable, damn honorable, I am a place British merchant. I am, and I will buy the beggarly hounds over and the finally his forms and the Marquis of the Stein and the Belch when she seeks through him to again an entry into the world of these very honorable the generality the nobility and indeed the court itself. You would be able to hold you on these you silly the little fool, you have got no money, not no little, no gentility, no blue blood, so no pedigree, no genealogy, but no money. The enlargement of the significance, but that I spoke to come to his than money and the commerce on the basis of just marriage, but the mortality at the end. I would be a good woman if I had 5,000 a year, and finally at the other hand the macro level as the basic of all family and the social relation, class interaction and the class mobility on what makes some of these novels thus as a newspaper of the century or an epoch representation of the structure of the whole society is the historical evolution. I cannot do better than create as a gloss the following from the great 19th century socialistic D. Tocqueville's The Old Regime and the French Revolution. It was not merely parliamentary government freedom to speech and the jury system that made England so different from the reset of the contemporary Europe. There was something still more destructive and more portray Europe. There was something still more destructive and the more for reaching the in his efforts. England was only the country in which the caste system had been totally abolished, not merely modified. Nobility and the commerciants joined forces in business enterprises and they entered the same professional and what is still more significant intermarriage. The daughter of the greatest lord in the land could marry a new man without the least composition. Page number 31. Thus the Dickens throw back the effect of the translation of the individual into the social historical by one constitution the theme of love and marriage, but now making the matrimonial appliance if reflect the class situation in England as observed by the Tocqueville, Rose Devon, and the daughter of Anne the Iron Morgan marrying the Squire's Queen Crevilian per Sir Pretty and Dombey. The city man marrying Bine would be for more appropriate would the daughter of and the western shabby gently aristocrat family so that we know have his crucius classes interaction which goes as the Tocqueville says from class activity to marriage combine the personal historical the gentry thus marrying downward for money and the merchant upward for generality honor rank and the social presides second to what may still be called irony but now not in the shape of fielding constant moving analysis of an individual but in the shape of the irony just position of the personal and the familial with the commercial and the such social as in a little itself of Dombey and Son which just poses Dombey position as the head of the commercial house and his position as the head of the family, especially in the father of son. The son launched for the prized as the capital of the house, men's and the dignity. The daughter scorned as the basis coin that would be not invested. Feminists may wish to note the change of the imaginary in the male here from the pastoral times on Tom Jones and his Captain Biffle describe woman as an animal of the domestic use. The most visibly important shift, of course, the shift of from the rural to the urban, foregrounding the dominant and the emergence of the merchant and the merchant prices as the new protagonist. I always recall the short description of the Dombey in the Dickens novel as a pecuniary duke of horse and the inclusion as the commerces the Tocqueville merge of the former antiquated ruling classes in England. But let me turn to the much greater novel Tocqueville Vanity Fair. His panoramic one-sided epic covering 17 years of the time and the space encompasses of the whole of the British Empire, first London, Queen's Crawley and the Bursley, the Napoleon Wars in Europe, then the West Indies, and then all the way of India to Ramganj near Calcutta. The time dimension and the space spread seems too enormous that it appears to be almost so luminous, and it all curious how these acts like us spokes radiating outward from the hub, and the hub is the city of London. The financial description of the London, because the we would not be have the industrial finance, the speculation finance, the hub holds a spoke through together. The novel is finally dominated by the rise of the fall and the fortunes of the two merchant families, the the Osborns and the Seedless, and again the true irony, the just position not just of these. Page number 32. Commercial fortunes, but of their family fortune, the marrying or not the marrying of their sons and daughter. No wonder that critics and the have recognized these novels as portrait of their own aperture. Barbara Hadley sees the 19th century English novel as the social and the describe described Tovari as the great social and the great accumulatory of the social symbol of class and money. Well, this is no doubt true. The the trackery it is also a totally indicate the totally dependent on the external symbolization, and the totally unaware of the subtle, subtle way in which the fuses individual with the social in the inner with the outer, and the physiological with the social. If I were to call him a socialistic, I would rather alien him with the modern socialistic who were theorists of ideology. He ranks in the book among the novelistic who may be called the pre-author also, but of this more in my last lecture. Crucially enough, his aspect of theory now were to be found in the modern criticism of him is hinted at by two of his oldest and the most fashioned critics on way his contemporary VC Roscoe, who is an 1856 essay say the social human heart that is the subject his active art destiny and the individual, but the personality character of each in is not the supreme object of the interest with the author. Man is his study, but man the social animal. Rosia's social animal almost becomes the ideological animal in the next criticism. W.C. Brownell 1902 essay almost but not quite largely because Brownell does not have the word ideology at hand and makes to do with the word idea instead. Trickery personages are never portrayed as in isolating. They are a part of the milieu in which they exist. Their activity are modified by the air they breathe in common. Their conduct are controlled, their ideas affected, even their degree, and the ambitious dictated by the generally idea of the social and their individual them. For its time, not a bad formulation of the idea and the individual subjects. Their conduct idea describe are constituted by the subjection of the ideology in the Brownwell phases, the general idea of the social that includes them. Well, this is a crux of the matter, how individual stories function as a picture, as a pouch, how and the diminution becomes and the effacement. I feel something more needs to be said and by and those who wish to consider development and the transformation within literally tradition and takes note. Page number 33. of not only the dominant but also, however, the briefly of the residual and the vanishing. This is a incumbent upon at least who begin with the idea of not two but three possible planes of representation upon the novelist, not just individual and social but also universal, and the promised besides to take into account the novelist's own definition of his chosen realm and realms. If Fielding comes before us as a moralist whose subject was human nature, Dickens in his letter to Foster outlining plans for Domini and the Sun declares that it was to do with pride, an external feeling of man, and the theory is his constant, often irritating authorial contemporary commentary makes his novel out of the meditation on the variety of human wishes. Ventas Vietnam, all his vanity, said the preacher, and the indeed I do sense when I read Vanity Fair and the Slacist for the book of the preacher is one of the source book or inspiration behind his national stage. If vanity is a sense like Fielding, human nature is a universal category, as is pride, the way Dickens means in his outline. I have already commented on the ambiguity of the Dickens title as a conjunction of the commercial and the familial. There's title combines the commercial with the universal, the fair, which means the marketplace, with vanity. The theory subtitle are on no doubt clear and state his subject as we understood it. Pen and pencil sketches of English society in the serial form. In the final version, a novel without a hero comes to a same thing in such as it is and collect portrait, a portrait not of individual heroes but of the whole society, which he calls Vanity Fair. But what but what do we say then about the ambiguity and the complicating universal? What we may suggest itself, I think it, if we finally not further ambiguity and the ambiguity of the narrative person in Vanity Fair, which, let me remind you, is that of the clown even more than that of the preacher in the Ecclesiastes, and to write which person he drew the attention on by sketches the cover of the novel been published in the monthly parts, and who his glasses and pen within the novel was not wearing the gown and bands and the shawl hat of the preacher, but the long eared lever and the cap and heels of the clown. And yet, as the observer, preacher or clown, the function of both in the telling bitter truth remain the same. In this theory, anticipated by the 100 years of the polishing philosopher Lysias Collapsi, well-known essay, The Christ and the Clown, reflection on the theological heritage in modern thinking, the function performed earlier by the priest is now performed by the clown, so that what we may say finally about the novel I have been considering is something like that. Following what this earlier English novel do is that to start the traditional normal universal categories, human nature, pride, vanity, and redefine them in terms on the contemporary material realities, so that what we see in them is page number 34 is reside of an internal struggle with the order modes of thoughts, as well as order modes on subjects of literature, and at the same time heightened by the internal struggle to break free from older modes through a more central abolishment and the representation of the socio-historical in terms that come close to our own understanding and expectation of what great novel do and in what author theoretically pride over upon heterogeneous and enriched domain. Notes. First, the odd quoted line is from the Benjamin Harris 1690, the New England primer. Harris, an English publisher who published anti-Catalonian pamphlet, was a figure in the Popish plot, a conspiracy invented by the Titus Oates, which resulted in the anti-Catholic heresies in England between 1968 and 1981. He removed to Boston in 1689, where he published a struggle bookstore and coffee house. He turned to London and the journalism in 1695, and his London Post appeared regularly from 1699 to 1706. Second, Belinsky and the Dobril Boy were influentially 19th century Russia literary critics were discussed in the second lecture. Nationality and the novel, where are the detailed note on them appear. Alexis Charlie Henry Marquet clearly Viscount de Tocqueville, born of a noble family, active in the French police services, briefly as Ministry of the Foreign Affairs after the Revolution of 1848, is best known as a political scientist and his and historian for his work Democracy in America and the Old Regime and Revolution, investigate the forces that leads to it and the stress its importance and the continuing the process of the modernizing France. Tocqueville studies English history as a model of the political development. Third, Thackeray title is taken from the John Begum's allegory and the Pilgrim's Progress 1698, where the Christians in the course of his journey from the city of the description all kinds of roundhouses, honor, preferment, titles, and the pleasure are traded. Fifth, Leszek Kolwowski, 1927-2009, Polish philosopher and a historian of idea, was the expelled from his professorship in Warsaw from political reason and the subsequently taught at Oxford. Rejected Marxism helped inspire the solidarity movement in the Poland and turned in his later writing to religious. His essay was made known by John Cott, who translated a key part and applied it to his reading of King Lear.